At 19, Hester Vale was homeless, hungry, and down to $8.13. Gideon Pike, the banker who had swallowed her family's debts and taught the town to repeat that her dead father had been a thief, had her put out because the rent was late and because he liked ruined names to stay ruined. All she had in the world was that little stack of coins wrapped in a handkerchief, a change of clothes, her mother's thimble, and the habit of standing straight even when sorrow bent everything around her. For $5, at Calder's weed-choked salvage siding beyond Mercy Switch, she bought a forgotten railroad car with one cracked window, a listing floor, and prairie grass growing up around its iron wheels. It was the kind of bargain sensible people mocked and desperate people made. Yet inside its warped walls, something had been sealed away so long that dust had nearly become its guard, and when Hester found it, a dead man's name would be mended, lost homes would be returned, and a thirsty town would remember what it owed its own. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Hester Vale. If you are listening from a place people pass by too quickly, tell us in the comments, because forgotten places often keep the truest stories. Mercy Switch sat where the plains of southeastern Colorado opened like a long rough palm beneath the sky, all wind and distance and hard light, with a siding, a water tower, a grain platform, 2 rows of weathered storefronts, and a patience born of dust. Trains stopped there long enough to take water, drop mail, load cattle, and then roll on toward places with larger depots and better roofs, but for the families who lived among its telegraph poles and cottonwoods, it was not a brief stop. It was the whole world. Hester had been born in a railroad section house painted a tired yellow, with a porch that listed in spring mud and a stove that breathed red all winter. Her father, Amos Vale, mended freight cars and passenger coaches for the Colorado Prairie Line, and her mother, Ruth, kept accounts for whoever could not keep them well enough alone, which meant nearly everyone who worked with hands too cracked for fine writing. Amos had large quiet hands, the kind that could lift a splintered board 1 hour and shell peas with care the next, and he believed that anything made by human effort carried a kind of honesty inside it, even if time and greed tried to cover it over. He showed Hester how to hear the difference between solid wood and hollow wood by the sound it gave under a knuckle, how to straighten bent nails over the flat of an axe, how to seal a draft with old flour sacks and tallow, how to judge a hinge not by its shine but by whether it held steady through weather. When she was 7, he let her hand him tools in the rail yard, and she learned the names of things other girls in town were never taught to see at all: brake wheel, kingbolt, journal box, sill beam, clerestory vent. He said the world liked to tell poor people that only money mattered, but workmanship mattered too, and notice mattered most of all. Rich men, he said, often survived by counting what was theirs, while poor people survived by noticing what others overlooked. Ruth taught her a different form of seeing. Ruth could look at a ledger and tell where fear had entered it. She knew which rancher rounded down when paying Mexican shearers, which widow stretched flour money by marking the same egg twice on credit, which merchant used a smudge of ink where shame should have stood in daylight. At night, after dishes were washed and little Alma and Owen were asleep beneath quilts made from old shirt backs, Ruth read aloud by lamplight from a Bible with loose pages, from a worn volume of poems no one in Mercy Switch could remember her buying, and from last year's newspapers saved for wrapping. She believed words could make a room larger than its walls, and Hester, sitting close enough to hear the lamp wick tick, grew up with the sound of stories braided into the sound of freight whistles. If Amos taught her that boards and bolts kept secrets, Ruth taught her that figures and sentences did too. The Vale children were not sheltered from hardship, but they were not raised in bitterness either. Alma, 4 years younger than Hester, had her mother's fine wrists and a laugh that always sounded surprised to exist. Owen, who came 3 years after Alma, belonged half to the earth and half to motion. He ran as if all distances were invitations. The family had little that could be counted valuable by bank men, yet there was nearly always bread, and if there was not bread there was soup, and if there was not soup there were potatoes baked in ash and apples dried on string and neighbors willing to trade because Ruth kept careful books and Amos repaired what other men charged to replace. Their yard held mint by the pump, sunflowers against the fence, and in spring a wash line bright as prayer flags with Ruth's aprons and Hester's patched skirts. They did not call themselves fortunate, because decent people in that country had seen too much to say such a thing casually, but they knew the feel of enough. Hester's best hours were the ones that belonged to work done beside someone she loved. She stood on a crate to help Ruth roll pastry thin for Sunday, and learned that patience kept dough tender. She followed Amos to the rail yard at dusk when the sky behind the freight shed turned copper, and watched sparks drift as men hammered couplings into place. More than once she climbed into retired cars waiting to be stripped, inhaling old coal smoke, pine tar, velvet dust, and the faint ghosts of journeys she would never take. To her, a railroad car was not merely a machine. It was a house that had moved, a room full of other people's hopes, an object built to carry weight across impossible distance. Amos, seeing how her fingers traced seams and latches, once smiled and told Ruth, with that private warmth fathers save for speaking truth over a child, that Hester had the soul of a finder. Not a seeker, he said, because seekers looked far off and missed what lay under the hand. A finder stayed still enough to hear what ordinary things were trying to say. Those lessons settled into her without show. By 12 she could mend shirts so the patch followed the grain of the cloth and lasted twice as long. By 14 she could reckon feed costs, flour tallies, and freight charges faster than some shopkeepers who had gone east to school. She knew how to split kindling fine in winter, braid onions for hanging, lift splinters from a horse's fetlock, reset a shelf with a level eye, and keep silent when silence spared another person pride. Mercy Switch was the kind of town where children reached usefulness early, and Hester did not think herself unusual. Yet something in her remained tuned to the small wrongness in a wall, the odd pause in a story, the missing piece in a row of numbers. If a pan was not where it belonged, she knew. If a door dragged after a storm, she could tell which hinge was warping before anyone touched it. If a man smiled too smoothly while setting terms, Ruth's hand would rest on Hester's wrist under the table, and the girl learned that trust was not owed merely because it had been requested. In those years the railroad seemed, to many in Mercy Switch, like a permanent fact of the world, as eternal as wind and harder than drought. But rail lines belonged to companies, and companies belonged to men who never tasted the dust their decisions lifted. Schedules changed. Freight contracts moved. Branch lines were trimmed when profit thinned. One year the company delayed repairs to the reservoir north of town, where runoff was meant to be held for the dry months. Another year it sold off parcels near the spring to a bank syndicate whose paperwork no one fully understood. Ruth began to see more signatures from widows, more pawning slips from farmers, more lines of credit extended against next season's hope. Amos came home quieter. He still kissed Ruth's temple when he entered and washed at the basin before supper, but Hester heard him wake at night and sit on the porch until the boards cooled beneath him. Still, Mercy Switch endured as frontier towns do, by gathering itself against every meanness that weather and money could devise. Men helped right overturned wagons even after arguing at market. Women sat with the sick whether or not they were owed a favor. Children learned to carry pails without sloshing and messages without embellishment. A schoolhouse of cottonwood boards stood beside a dry patch where, after rain, grass briefly remembered itself. The church bell had a crack in it, yet rang. The depot roof leaked, yet mail came. In that hard-boned place, Hester's values were not recited like sermons. They were practiced in the ordinary traffic of need: mend before discarding, feed before judging, count true, speak plain, and when a thing seems empty, knock first to make certain. The beginning of the family's fall did not announce itself with thunder. It entered the way ruin often enters, disguised as delay. Amos's wages came late one month, then light the next. A foreman from Denver was sent to improve efficiencies, which meant men were dismissed who knew too much and younger men were hired who would not ask why supplies vanished on paper before they vanished in truth. Gideon Pike, who owned the bank, half the storefront mortgages, and the newest suit in town, began appearing more often at the depot platform, talking low with company men and spreading his hands as if every hardship could be solved by signing one more note in his office. He called debt an inconvenience and interest a necessity, and because he smiled when he said these things, some people mistook him for kind. That autumn a boiler burst on a work train west of the switch and killed 2 brakemen, leaving wives and children with almost nothing. A relief subscription was raised in town, then added to buy the company in a gesture so loudly praised that few noticed how small the sum truly was. Ruth helped keep the subscription ledger. Amos, because he was trusted with carpentry and because he could be discreet, was asked to repair an old clerestory office car the line intended to use for storing records during depot renovations. It had once belonged to a superintendent, then a survey crew, then no one important enough to remember. Amos came home with soot on his cuffs and a look Hester would think about for years afterward, not fear exactly, but the expression of a man who has laid his hand on a rotten board and felt the whole staircase give. When Ruth asked what troubled him, Amos said only that numbers were being moved like game pieces and land was changing owners without those owners understanding how. He never spoke against a person lightly, yet even he said Pike's name as though it tasted of nails. Hester saw them whispering after the younger children slept. Once she woke at midnight and found Amos sitting at the table with the relief ledger open beside papers she had never seen, maps with blue lines and seals stamped in red wax. Ruth stood at the window, not watching the street but listening to it. When Hester shifted on the floorboard, both parents looked up sharply. Amos covered the papers at once, then, seeing it was only her, softened and drew her close. "If ever the world grows mean all at once," he murmured into her hair, "remember that truth can go underground a spell without dying." Within a fortnight he was dead. The railroad said it was an accident at the yard, a coupling gone wrong at dusk, one car nudging another while a pin had not been properly set. Men who had seen such things before nodded with grim acceptance, because rail work killed fast and often. But Hester never forgot that her father had left that morning carrying a small canvas satchel he did not bring home, nor that Gideon Pike himself came to the house before the burial, hat in hand and sorrow arranged across his face like a purchased cloth. He told Ruth there was a further grief to bear. Papers related to the relief subscription and several land transfers were missing. Amos had been the last man known to work alone in the office car where those papers were kept. Of course Pike did not wish to accuse the dead unfairly, but questions were being asked. Until matters were settled, there would be a delay in benefits owed. It was the kind of cruelty respectable men preferred, because it required no raised voice. No one came and shouted thief at the grave. Instead doors cooled. Credit shortened. Conversations paused when Ruth entered. Some neighbors stayed loyal, and Ezra Boone, the old porter with silver whiskers and a cane polished by his hand, nearly struck one man for repeating a rumor within earshot of the children. But rumor has long legs in a small town, and once a banker gave it shelter, it walked freely. Ruth lost bookkeeping work first from the hotel, then from Pike's grain office, then from 3 households that said they could manage on their own. Hester took in washing, mending, and floor scrubbing wherever she could. She rose before light, boiled shirts in lye, rubbed cuffs raw, stitched until her eyes burned, and still each month the numbers darkened. Then came the dry year that split gardens, shortened tempers, and left the North Reservoir a shallow dish of mud fringed by cracked reeds. Pike called in notes on 3 families in 1 week. The schoolteacher's coal bill doubled. Water from the spring below town, once common enough that boys splashed there with boots off in May, began to be fenced and measured. Pike's bank held the paper for that spring now, he said, management required discipline. Ruth, who had never spoken in town meetings unless fact was being ignored, stood up one Saturday in the Mercantile and said a common spring ought never to have been privately held at all. Pike only smiled and answered that if her husband had not misplaced important documents, many matters might appear differently. Shame and grief did not kill Ruth at once, but they leaned hard upon her lungs. By winter she had a cough that bent her double. Hester warmed bricks for the bed, brewed horehound tea, and worked with a fierceness that made her hands look years older than her face. Alma learned to hush herself. Owen stopped asking when their father would come back in dreams and started asking when the grocer would give credit again. The yellow house went first. Pike's bank took it under foreclosure so quietly that only the scrape of strangers moving furniture made the loss feel real. The Valles rented 2 rooms above the harness shop. Ruth died there in February while wind hissed under the eaves and Hester, 19 all of 3 weeks, held her shoulders through the last of the coughing. Before the body had been lowered, practical people began using practical words. How would the children be supported? Who would assume responsibility? Was there work enough in town for a young woman and 2 dependents when so many men were already idle? Hester said she would manage. She believed it, too, because girls raised in necessity are trained to mistake endurance for inexhaustibility. But Mercy's switch had grown meaner in its fear. Alma was sent to live with Ruth's sister in Trinidad, not because Hester wished it, but because Aunt Elna arrived with a rail ticket and a warning that girls without guardians were talked about cruelly. Owen was bound out by a probate arrangement. Hester scarcely understood to work on a cattle spread south of town for room, board, and the promise of schooling that almost never came. She watched both children leave in different directions within the same month and felt something inside her go as still as a frozen bucket. Even then she kept going. She rented a narrow room in the back of Mrs. Gannett's boarding house and washed restaurant aprons, patched overalls, copied letters for the preacher, and once spent 3 nights in succession sitting with a miner's wife in labor because no doctor could be fetched in time. She ate sparingly, saved coins in a blue handkerchief, and wrote to Alma in a neat careful hand every Sunday. Owen's ranch foreman allowed letters less often, but she wrote anyway. What she could not overcome was Pike's shadow. He held the mortgage on Mrs. Gannett's place. He held the hotel accounts. He held the water notes. When Hester applied for steady work at the grain office, Pike glanced over her references and said he did not keep loose blood around figures. When she asked what he meant, he replied that dishonesty had a family odor, and respectable enterprises learned to notice it. The final push into homelessness came in June, on an afternoon when heat lifted from the road in wavering sheets and even the flies seemed too tired to argue. Mrs. Gannett, flustered and smelling of yeast, stood in Hester's doorway with Pike himself behind her in the hall. Rent was 3 weeks late. Hester had part of it, not all. Pike held out a document and said he might consider leniency if she signed a statement withdrawing any future claim the Vale family might make regarding old railroad matters, claims he called delusions inherited from a mother made feverish by grief. Hester read enough to understand that the paper would do more than settle rent. It would say, in her own hand, that Amos Vale had no rightful connection to the missing relief documents and that any story to the contrary was slander. She looked up at Pike and saw, perhaps for the first time with full clarity, that his calm was not strength. It was appetite. She set the paper back in his hand and told him no. By sundown her trunk sat on the boardwalk. Mrs. Gannett cried while carrying it out, but she carried it all the same. Hester wrapped her coins, her thimble, and 2 letters from Alma in a handkerchief, tucked them into her bodice, and walked out of town with nowhere certain to go. The world had narrowed to dust, twilight, and a stubborn need to remain standing in her own name. There are hours when a person becomes so emptied of options that an absurd choice begins to resemble faith. Hester crossed the freight road beyond the depot, past heaps of tie ends and rusting couplings, and came at last to Calder's salvage siding where retired cars waited with their windows gone blind and their paint scaled away by weather. Men scavenged there for usable iron, stove parts, and door hardware. Boys dared each other to climb and jump from roofs. Cows rubbed against wool trucks sunk in weeds. It was not a place one went to begin again. It was a place things went after usefulness had been declared over. The railroad car she chose was set apart from the others on a short dead spur half swallowed by buffalo grass. It had once been dark green, perhaps, or blue, but sun and years had carried off certainty. One step hung crooked, the roof vents leaned like broken hats. Its iron wheels were fixed in place by time, and prickly pears spread near one axle as if claiming the right to remain after industry forgot itself. Yet its frame still stood straighter than the boxcars beside it, and when Hester laid her hand against the siding, she felt under the warped boards an old firmness that answered her palm. The door resisted at first, then opened with a long wooden groan that sent pigeons fluttering from the rafters. Inside were dust, torn leather, mouse droppings, one cracked lamp bracket, a cast-iron stove bolted to the floor, and the deep stale smell of coal soot, pine pitch, rain seepage, and abandoned journeys. Sensible people would have backed away. Hester stepped in farther. Calder, who owned the salvage rights and missed little that might become coin, laughed when she asked the price. "For scrap or shelter," he said. "Because it ain't good at either." "For a roof," she said. "That old office car." He spat into the weeds and squinted, perhaps trying to decide whether pity or mockery would better suit the moment. $5 if you haul it, which you can't. $5 if you don't, which seems dumber. She had $8.13. If she paid him, she would have just enough left for lamp oil, meal, soap, and maybe coffee if she was careful. If she did not, she had no roof at all. So she counted $5 silver into his hand and signed a receipt on the back of a freight invoice, becoming in the strangest legal manner the owner of a railroad car too forgotten for anyone else to want. Calder tipped his hat as if making sport of a lady purchaser. Hester did not answer. She carried her trunk inside, swept a patch of floor with a juniper branch, and by nightfall had made a bed from old seat cushions, her blanket and 2 burlap sacks found under a bench. That first night, with wind rubbing at the car sides and moonlight slipping through cracks like pale water, she lay awake listening to the small language of old wood. Boards contracted after heat. A loose chain under the frame clicked once. Somewhere in the wall a mouse made a dry quick journey and stopped. Hester, who had spent childhood hearing her father judge structures by their voices, began without fully deciding to do so what finders do. She listened past fear. Beneath the ordinary creaks, there was another quality in the stove end of the car, a difference not loud but distinct, the kind of muffled reserve one finds where a wall has been thickened or a cavity kept. She rose with the moon still up, crossed the slanted floor barefoot, and tapped the paneling with the handle of Ruth's old kitchen knife. Most of it answered with a shallow plank note. One section beside the iron stove answered deeper, close-throated, as though a second wall sat behind the first. Morning brought work before mystery. Hester hauled buckets from town, swallowed pride with every trip, scrubbed the floor, patched the cracked window with oiled cloth, wired the hanging step into place, and beat dust from cushions until her hair and lashes turned gray with it. As she cleaned, details emerged. The car was not a boxcar at all but an old office or private service car, shortened from some grander purpose and plain now except for a faint line of hand-painted gold leaf near the ceiling. One built-in desk remained with a drawer warped shut. A rack for maps or umbrellas leaned in one corner. Under a bench she found a brass coat hook shaped like a swallow. On the inside of a cabinet door, nearly hidden beneath grime, someone had carved with a careful hand the initials AV. She sat down very slowly. Amos Vale had worked many cars in his years, and initials alone could have meant anything. Yet the letters were cut with the same plain strength she remembered from the labels he once scratched on tool handles so they would come home again. Beneath them, almost invisible, was a mark he had used in private fun when the children were small, a tiny notch like a roof over the V, meant to turn the name into a house. Hester touched it with one fingertip and felt her throat close. The forgotten car was not merely shelter. At some point before his death, her father had been here long enough to leave a sign. Whether it was habit, accident, or message, she could not yet know. The warped desk drawer yielded that afternoon after she pried one side with a spoon handle. Inside lay nothing of worth at first glance, 2 rusted tacks, a pencil nub, mouse-chewed paper, and an old brass key on a ring stamped with the number 4. But the paper, once she brushed it free of debris, was not random trash. It was a torn corner of stationery bearing the faded words Mercy Switch Relief Committee and the lower curve of Ruth's handwriting on the back, only 2 surviving words, North Spring. Hester stared until the letters blurred. Her mother's hand in the drawer, her father's initials in the cabinet, the hollow note behind the stove wall, 3 small things, each explainable alone, together impossible to ignore. She spent the next days earning food where she could and returning each evening to the car with salvaged nails, a jar, a hammer borrowed from Ezra Boone, and her mind alight in a way hunger could not quite dim. Ezra had known Amos better than most. He had worked porter duty on passenger runs for 25 years until his knees gave out, and now swept depot floors for modest pay and the privilege of overhearing news before anyone else, when Hester showed him the brass key and, after a hesitation born of both hope and fear, told him about the initials. His old eyes sharpened that he said the car had once been called the Oriole by crews who liked giving names to things the company numbered. It had hauled supervisors in its first years, then survey men, then records, and later sat and used after a fire singed one end. He remembered Amos repairing its interior the week before the fatal coupling. He remembered, too, a woman from Denver, a widowed attorney or claims officer named Abigail Marin, arriving on the line months before Amos died and meeting twice in private with Ruth, Amos, the schoolmaster, and two brakemen's widows about the relief subscription and land around the spring. Then Abigail Marin had vanished from Mercy Switch in a March blizzard while trying to reach the county seat. "Your daddy wasn't afeard easy," Ezra said softly, turning the key in his palm. But that week he kept looking over his shoulder, and not because of ghosts. Did he trust this Marin woman? Trusted her more than he trusted Pike, which ain't saying little. Ezra handed the key back. "If there's something in that car, child, it ain't there by accident." The hollow panel did not open to force alone. Hester learned that on the second night she tried. The planks beside the stove were fastened not with visible nails but with pegs sunk and puttied over, a craftsman's work meant to disappear. She would have missed the release if Amos had not long ago shown her how some makers hid access in trim rather than paneling. Under the window ledge, behind a strip of molding no wider than 2 fingers, she found one brass screw threaded opposite the others. Her hands trembled so badly she had to stop twice before she could turn it with the blade of the knife. The molding came loose. So did a narrow latch plate. Then a section of wall, no broader than a breadboard and twice as tall, eased inward with a sigh of wood on wood and revealed a compartment sealed from dust more carefully than any cupboard in the car. Inside lay an oilskin bundle, a flat tin map tube, and a leather ledger bound with a cracked red strap. For a long moment Hester only knelt there in the dusk, one hand gripping the panel edge, because the world had narrowed to that secret space and she feared that if she breathed too hard it would vanish like a dream. At last she lifted the bundle and found it heavier than paper alone. The oilskin, once untied, released the dry sweet smell of old ink. There were deeds folded with ribbons, survey plats, a sheaf of notarized affidavits, and beneath them 4 narrow bond certificates from the Colorado Prairie line, each stamped with interest coupons still attached. The leather ledger was titled in Ruth's hand, Mercy Switch Widows and Works Trust. On the inside cover was a list of contributions made after the boiler deaths, wages pledged, goods sold, company match promised, land identified near the North Spring for a public reservoir, school repairs, and 6 widow cottages to be held in common trust for families thrown off by rail injury or drought. Every page Ruth had ever kept might as well have risen from the grave. The deeper she read, the more the shape of the old wrong emerged. The relief subscription had not been mere charity. Abigail Marin had organized it into a legal trust, binding company funds, private gifts, and town labor toward permanent community works, water access, school upkeep, and housing no banker could seize from widows over a late note. The trust depended on a charter and the original surveyed plat of the spring property. Yet a second set of papers in the bundle showed that Gideon Pike, working with a line superintendent named Hollis Creed, had quietly filed competing claims against the same parcels through Pike's bank. Affidavits from 2 brakemen's widows stated they had been pressured to sign documents they could not read. One map, marked by an official county seal, showed plainly that the spring and adjoining lots had never lawfully transferred into Pike's private control at all. Their title had been suspended pending final recording of Marin's trust. At the bottom of the oilskin bundle, wrapped separately in a square of faded blue cloth, Hester found 2 letters. One was from Abigail Marin to Ruth and Amos, written in a steady spare hand 6 days before Amos died. Pike, she said, had learned that the trust, once recorded, would strip him of leverage over half the town's most vulnerable families. He meant to make the original packet disappear before she could file it at county court. She asked Amos to conceal the papers temporarily in the office car he was repairing, where no one but a carpenter would think to search inside the wall, and she promised to return within a week with a federal land clerk traveling west on business. If misfortune intervened, Amos was to deliver the packet to Judge Ellery Shaw in Los Animas, whose name and office address were included below. The second letter was from Amos himself to Ruth, never sent, likely hidden with the rest when time failed him. If this packet was being opened by family, he wrote, then something had gone wrong. He had not stolen a penny. He had hidden what belonged to Mercy Switch until it could be safely recorded. He was sorry for the weight it might place upon them, but truth, once buried, was still truth, and Hester above all would know how to find the seam that we do not often receive such tenderness from the dead, and when it comes, it does not feel gentle at first. Hester bent over the letter until her forehead touched the dusty floorboards and wept without sound. She wept for the months Ruth had spent being looked through in shops, for Alma waving brave from the train step, for Owen riding away to labor because the world had named his father crooked, for the yellow house lost and the spring fenced and every small humiliation Pike had managed beneath the cover of law. Yet under the grief there came a steadier thing. Not triumph. Not yet. It was recognition. The compass of her life, broken since Amos died, gave one clean turn and pointed home to truth. By dawn she had reread every paper twice. By noon she understood both the promise and the danger. If the packet was genuine, and she knew in her bones it was, then Pike's control over the North Spring, the widow cottages, and several foreclosed lots could be challenged. The trust bonds, with years of attached interest, might fund the reservoir and school after all. Her family's name would be cleared. But if Pike learned the documents had surfaced before they were copied and placed beyond his reach, he would do what men like him always did when paper threatened appetite, he would call it false, claim ownership, or make the evidence disappear. She began, therefore, with secrecy and with work. Ezra Boone hid the bond certificates inside the lining of his porter's trunk. Miss Beulah Hart, the schoolteacher, copied the key affidavits in her immaculate hand after locking the schoolhouse door against summer dust. Reverend Sloane, who had buried both Amos and Ruth and carried more sorrow than his narrow shoulders suggested, compared signatures from the trust ledger with the church charity rolls and swore they matched. Hester herself took the map and, with Miss Hart beside her, walked to the North Spring where Pike's hired fence cut across a path generations of children had used. The survey lines in the bundle matched the land so exactly, down to a bent cottonwood and a rock split like a boot heel, that even skepticism had to stand back and stare. The mystery deepened not because the papers became less clear, but because their reach widened. Hidden among the trust pages were lists of cottage numbers, grain allotments, and names of laborers owed relief not yet paid when the documents vanished. There were Mexican track men, a black fireman's widow, 2 Czech farm families, a washerwoman with 4 children, and Amos himself listed only as carpenter, volunteer. But enough. Mrs. Ortega from the wash yard brought food and said her brother's name appeared in the trust list, she would testify to that anywhere. Reverend Sloane offered the church strongbox for temporary storage. Old Mr. Pelly, who ran the telegraph office, said Pike's land filings had always smelled of haste and that he still had copied messages from Abigail Marin requesting county verification the week before she disappeared. Even Calder, greedy but not wholly rotten, admitted under gruff questioning that he had sold the car outright, receipt signed and witnessed, and would say so in front of any magistrate if paid the dignity of being asked properly. We would like to believe communities awaken all at once when truth appears, but often they wake by inches, each person only as brave as the next door allows. Still, Pike held the bank, the water notes, and the nearest road to official legitimacy. He announced a public auction to be held in 10 days for defaulted properties tied to the North Spring district, including the schools with lot and the widow cottages. If he completed the sale before the trust packet was recorded, any later challenge would become slower, costlier, and easier to tangle in appeals. Hester understood then that the papers alone were not enough. Truth buried can survive, yes, but truth unfiled can still be throttled by timing. She needed the documents before county authority at once. Los Animas lay 2 days away by wagon in good weather, farther if the roads baked hard and split, farther still if Pike guessed her route. Ezra insisted she should not travel alone. Miss Hart offered to go, but the school preparations held her. In the end it was Reverend Sloane who harnessed the church mare to a small trap and said he had buried enough honest people under bad paper for one lifetime. Hester wrapped the originals in oilskin, stitched the bond certificates into the hem of her petticoat, tucked Amos's letter against her stays, and before dawn left Mercy Switch under a sky so pale it seemed the day had not yet chosen whether to begin. The journey widened the stakes in ways a small town never can. On the road south they passed abandoned shacks with doors banging in wind, a dry stock pond ringed white with alkali, and homesteads where laundry still flapped on lines although no smoke rose from the chimneys. Frontier country teaches that misfortune is rarely private. What had happened in Mercy Switch, documents withheld, water claimed, widows pressed, land turned from common need toward private advantage, had happened in a dozen names across the plains. At noon on the second day they reached Judge Ellery Shaw's office only to learn he had died the previous winter. For one bleak hour it seemed the dead had conspired with time to close every door. Then a clerk, spectacled and kind in the overworked manner of men who handle too much paper for too little pay, recognized Abigail Marin's name. Her final packet had never arrived, he said, but a memorandum remained on file noting suspected interference with the Mercy Switch Trust. If Hester possessed the originals, the county recorder could take provisional custody immediately and issue a stay against related auction actions pending review. Pike had moved faster than they guessed. By the time the recorder examined the seals and signatures, a telegram from Mercy Switch already waited claiming that fraudulent documents were being circulated by the daughter of a deceased rail employee known to be under suspicion. Hester expected this, yet seeing the slander transformed into official wire chilled her just the same. The recorder, a woman named Mrs. Bell Cather who wore her gray hair pinned like armor, read the telegram without expression, then asked Hester to place every paper on the table in order of date. Hester did. She spoke carefully, not embellishing where grief tempted embellishment, not pleading where anger invited it. She showed the hidden compartment letter from Marin, the trust ledger in Ruth's hand, Pike's competing land claims, the survey plat, the witness affidavits, the coupon bonds, and Amos's unsent note. Mrs. Cather compared seals, checked filing references against older books, and at last looked up with a steadiness that reminded Hester painfully of her mother. "Miss Vale," she said, "this is either the most elaborate fraud I have ever seen in a county office, or your town has been robbed with pen and stamp." By evening the papers were entered provisionally, copies certified, and a stay order issued by wire on the spring district auction. The railroad, informed that its bond certificates and a deceased superintendent's name appeared in potential misappropriation, dispatched counsel to Mercy Switch at once, not from virtue but from fear of public scandal. Reverend Sloane thanked Providence aloud. Hester did not. She had seen too much to mistake partial justice for miracle. Still, when she stepped outside the courthouse with certified copies under her arm, the air tasted different, as if for the first time in years her lungs had room to reach the bottom of a breath. The real conflict awaited at home. Pike met the returning trap at the edge of Mercy Switch, standing in front of the bank with townspeople drawn by rumor into a rough half-circle. His black coat was brushed, his collar clean, his face arranged for injured propriety. Beside him stood the constable, Calder, two grain men whose notes Pike held, and Mrs. Gannett wringing her apron. Hester understood that this was his chosen field, not a courtroom but a public square, where confidence could imitate truth before people and use to legal language. He said she had slandered a respectable businessman, meddled with company property, and exploited grief for gain. He said all her sudden concern for community masked a simple aim, to enrich herself off old confusion. Then, with the cruel instinct of men who believe poverty discredits the poor, he asked whether she expected Mercy Switch to trust a girl living in a derelict rail car. There are moments when a life turns not on what is revealed, but on whether the revealed thing is carried with dignity. Hester did not shout. She did not call him names, though several would have suited. She unfolded the county stay order and handed it first, not to Pike, but to the constable, forcing the law to look at law before personality could intervene. Then she spoke so all could hear. She named the trust. She named the widows. She named the spring. She named the school lot and the cottages and the laborers' allotments. She named Amos Vale not as martyr, not as victim, but as carpenter and volunteer who had hidden what Pike meant to bury forever. Then she read from Abigail Marin's letter and from the page of Ruth's ledger listing contributions many in the crowd remembered making: 2 sacks flour, $5, fence labor, lumber, 1 mare loan for hauling stone, 27 days' wages pledged by the boiler crew before the accident that killed them. Faces shifted. Memory moved through the square like weather. Pike tried to laugh it off. He said papers could be forged. Mrs. Ortega stepped forward and pointed to her brother's name in the copied trust list and said she had watched him sign with his left hand because his right had been crushed in switching. Reverend Sloane read aloud the county recorder's notation of suspected interference. Mr. Pelly produced preserved telegraph copies showing Marin's requests for verification before her disappearance. Pike tried to laugh it off. He said papers could be forged. Mrs. Ortega stepped forward and pointed to her brother's name in the copied trust list and said she had watched him sign with his left hand because his right had been crushed in switching. Reverend Sloane read aloud the county recorder's notation of suspected interference. Mr. Pelly produced preserved telegraph copies showing Marin's requests for verification before her disappearance. Calder, unexpectedly, declared before everyone that the car had been sold free and clear for $5 because nobody but Hester had seen worth in it, and that if Pike wanted to claw back a bargain now, he ought to admit he had come late to honesty. That should have been enough, but greed seldom yields because truth has spoken once. Pike announced that even if the auction was stayed, the town could not run on sentiment. The reservoir remained broken. The cottages were decayed. The school roof leaked. The spring required management. He asked, with scorn sharpened to sound practical, where the money for restoration would come from. Hester, who had kept one fact back because timing matters in justice as much as in war, reached into the pocket sewn inside her skirt and withdrew the certified copies of the bond certificates. The Colorado Prairie Line Council, a grave young attorney newly arrived from Denver by the noon train, stepped from the depot crowd and said those bonds, if validated, and all indications suggested they would be, represented company funds specifically matched to the Mercy Switch Trust and grown with years of unpaid interest. The line, eager to quiet scandal involving Hollis Creed's filings, would recognize them under court supervision. The hush that followed belonged not to money alone but to reversal. For years Pike had made Mercy Switch believe scarcity was a law of God. Now the town saw scarcity had been managed, directed, used as leash and bridle. We do not need to imagine Pike's humiliation as loud. The deepest kind is often quiet. It appeared when men who owed him notes stopped meeting his eye with obedience and started meeting it with calculation. It appeared when Mrs. Gannett moved away from his shoulder instead of nearer. It appeared when the constable asked, in a voice dry as paper, whether Mr. Pike wished to answer questions regarding disputed filings. It appeared when Alma's aunt, who had arrived on the afternoon train by chance and rumor, stood at the back of the crowd with the girl beside her and heard Hester say in front of everyone that she sought no private fortune from the trust, only the return of what had been withheld from the whole town. Pike was not dragged off in chains, because life is rarely so theatrical where power has worn a collar and brushed its boots. His justice came the way rot reveals itself in a beam long painted over. Bank examiners came within weeks. The railroad filed suit. Families whose cottages had been threatened withheld payments until title was settled. The spring fence was ordered removed pending adjudication. His deposits thinned. Men who had flattered him suddenly remembered they had only ever respected solvency. By autumn he was still in Mercy Switch, but smaller, as if certainty had gone out of his bones. He rented rooms above his own bank after selling the house with the blue shutters, and when he crossed the street people no longer parted to make room. Frontier towns do not always punish the wicked swiftly, but they are expert at letting them live amid the measure of what they have made. For Hester, restoration began with refusal of greed. The railroad council offered a personal settlement if she would cede broad claims and let the matter close quietly. Enough money to buy a neat house, he said, perhaps start fresh in Pueblo. She declined. She had lived too long among people taught to leave whenever staying became inconvenient to someone richer. Under county oversight, the bonds were redeemed into the revived Mercy Switch Widows and Works Trust. The first funds repaired the reservoir embankment and lined the spring channel with stone. The widow cottages, though weathered, were deeded into common protection exactly as Marin had intended. The school roof was replaced before snow. A public ledger, open for all to inspect, was kept not in the bank but in the schoolhouse under lock and duplicate key, one held by Miss Hart and one by Reverend Sloane. Then Hester asked that the old office car on the dead spur be moved, at trust expense and with community labor, to a rise near the school cottonwoods. Some laughed affectionately at the idea until they saw what she saw. The car had been shelter when she had none, evidence when truth had nearly died, and a vessel large enough for more than one purpose. Men jacked it inch by inch from the swallowed rails. Boys ran messages. Mrs. Ortega and Aunt Elna scrubbed the interior. New glass was set into the windows. The stove was mended, the walls lined, the roof tarred, and the faded swallow coat hook polished until it gleamed. One half became a reading room and records office for the trust, where ledgers could be kept in honest light. The other half, divided by a curtain, became Hester's home until something larger could be managed. Over the door, burned into a cedar plank by Ezra Boone's careful hand, were the words "The Oriole House." Alma came back before the first frost, taller, grave, and clinging to Hester for one long unchildish moment before stepping back to help unpack without being asked. Owen returned from the cattle spread thin as fence wire but with a new steadiness in him, as though labor had made him older and reunion allowed him to be young again. Their family was not restored to what it had been. Such restorations belonged to fairy tales, not prairie towns. Amos and Ruth did not walk through the door in evening light. The yellow house did not reassemble itself from memory. But the Valles gathered again under one roof, and sometimes that is the truest form of forever available on earth. With the trust settled, Hester could have claimed a substantial private portion through her father's volunteer role and her mother's bookkeeping. Instead she took only what the charter properly allowed the family: return of the foreclosed lot on which their yellow house had once stood, wages and fees wrongfully withheld after Amos's death, and a small stipend for serving as trust clerk. On the old lot, near the mint that had improbably survived by the fence line, she planted beans in spring and sunflowers after. The larger work mattered more to her. She wrote letters for widows who wished to challenge notes. She taught older boys and girls how to read the public ledger so no one could again use figures as a veil. She kept the Oriole House open on cold evenings for children who wanted stories and women who wanted quiet. In time Mercy Switch began calling the place simply the car, as though no further explanation were needed. Everyone knew which car was meant. There is a reason we began by telling you her age and her emptiness as plainly as we did. At 19, Hester Vale was indeed homeless, hungry, and down to $8.13, and for $5 she did indeed buy a forgotten railroad car because there are seasons in a life when foolishness and faith wear the same coat. But what altered her future was not luck alone, nor secret wealth arriving like magic to reward the blameless. It was the long training of a girl who had been taught to hear hollowness in walls, falsehood in ledgers, and worth in what the world had marked salvage. It was her mother's neat hand refusing to die in dust. It was her father's craft making a hiding place sturdy enough to outlast corruption. It was a town, ashamed at last of its own fear, choosing to remember that mercy had once been part of its name. Years later, travelers passing through Mercy Switch would sometimes stop at the curious sight of an old railroad car set near a schoolyard, smoke rising from its chimney in winter, children bent over books inside, and a woman at the desk by the front window writing in a ledger with calm exactness. Some asked whose idea it had been. Some asked why the place mattered. Those who belonged there often answered by telling the story poorly at first, then better, because important stories improve with use. They said the car had saved the town, though Hester would have denied that and named instead all the hands that hauled, copied, testified, cooked, roofed, and stayed. They said a hidden compartment changed her family forever, which was true, though not because treasure made them grand. It gave them back their dead honestly. It gave them back one another. It gave them back a future not built on begging those who had wronged them for permission to live. And Hester herself, when she heard such talk and was pressed to speak, would sometimes rest her hand on the window frame Amos had once touched and say only that forgotten things are not always empty, and abandoned things are not always finished. Then she would smile, small and real, and return to her work, because dignity after suffering often looks less like triumph than steadiness. The banker's name faded from signs. The spring ran clearer after the channel was lined. The school bell was recast without the crack. Children grew up hearing the Vale name linked not to theft but to keeping faith. That is how justice most deeply answers harm, not by noise, but by changing what the next generation believes about who belonged to honor all along. And that is why, when we say her name now, we say it with the fullness it earned. Hester Vale. Thank you for spending this time with us in Mercy Switch and walking beside Hester through dust, grief, and the slow return of what should never have been taken. If this story stayed with you, share it with someone who believes worn-out things have nothing left to give. And before you go, tell us this: what is a time you found value in something others had already written off? We always love reading the places where your own stories meet ours. Until next time, stay close.